I wonder if you have a favourite psalm. I'm sure most of us have a few psalms that are particularly close to our hearts or rooted in some personal experience perhaps. I'm quite sure that for many Christians, Psalm 40 would be up there with their favourite 3 or 4 at least. I can't read this psalm, but without hearing the words of the Scottish Psalter version ringing in my ears, I waited for the Lord my God, and patiently did bear. At length to me he did incline my voice and cry to hear. It's a wonderful, moving, powerful testimony from David about how God has delivered him and rescued him from great trouble. So we're going to take 2 sessions to look at Psalm 40. We're going to look today at the first 10 verses, which I divided into 2 further sections, 1 to 4 and 5 to 10. And in 1 to 4 you have David's testimony to God's people, and in verses 5 to 10 you have David's thanksgiving to God himself. But in verse 9, in that last section, he talks about what he's done by giving testimony to God's people. So he says in verse 9, I have told the glad news of deliverance in the great congregation. So David is telling God's people, probably in the tabernacle or in some great assembly, of a particular situation where he has cried aloud to God and God has come and intervened and helped him. We don't know what that situation was, but in David's life we're not short of options to choose from. But I love that generality because it means we can more easily identify with it. We don't know what that pit was, whether it was a literal pit, whether it's a metaphorical pit of great danger that David was in. It doesn't really matter. There was a pit, and God rescued him when David cried out to him. Not immediately, it would seem, because he waited patiently. And so it's a great opportunity for us to, in our own situation, whatever pit we may feel ourselves in, even at this moment in time, or we can look back and see ourselves in a pit of some sort or other, and we cry aloud to the Lord. So whatever pit you may be in at the moment, cry aloud to the Lord and wait patiently, and he will deliver you. Because the greatest pit of all was the pit of sin and death and deserving of hell. And if you're a Christian, then God has delivered you from that and set your feet upon the rock that is the rock of the Lord Jesus Christ. But then be careful to do what David did and go and tell others, declare his praise, testify to him in the great congregation, that is among the people of God. And then verses 5 to 10, David's thanksgiving to God himself. David turns back to God, his understanding, his appreciation of God's acts and of his attributes and of his faithfulness to him. And there's an interesting juxtaposition of ideas here. He says in verse 6, in sacrifice and offering you have not delighted, but you have given me an open ear. Now David is not rubbishing the sacrificial system. David is a devout believer and a worshipper in God, and he's happy to conform to the rules that God has laid down in his word, and he'll have carried out the necessary sacrifices. But what he's really saying is, what you desire more than those things is not a sacrifice of a blood or the blood of a bull or a goat. It's the sacrifice of my life, of my heart. The lovely phrase at the end of verse, or halfway through verse 6, you have given me an open ear. Literally it says in the Hebrew, ears you have dug for me. So what colourful expression. What David is really saying is that God has opened my ears to hear his voice through his word, so I may know what God really wants. And that's not just to go through the actions and the rituals of worship, it's to present my life as a living sacrifice. For me, it's reminiscent of Romans 12. Therefore, present your bodies as a living sacrifice to God, which is your reasonable, your appropriate worship, as you give your whole being over to God. But what's particularly significant about these verses in Psalm 40 is that the verses 9 to 10 are quoted in Hebrews 10 and applied to the Lord Jesus Christ. He has come to fulfill all that God had prescribed for him in his word from the beginning of time. So he's come to do the will of God. And the will of God for Jesus was to die in the place of sinners, to rescue us from the pit of sin, to set our feet upon a rock that is himself. And so Jesus' obedience through his sacrifice on the cross is contrasted with the inadequacy and the insufficiency of the old Mosaic rituals and sacrifices. Now, if Jesus dying on a cross in our place isn't the best news there is to go and tell everybody as loudly and as freely as we possibly can I don't know what is. And I hope your testimony today is that God has rescued you from a miry pit. And God has set your feet upon a rock. And now you're going to spend your life testifying to God's people and to others as well of God's faithfulness and goodness to you in the person of the Lord Jesus Christ. And I hope that God has dug out ears for you and continues to dig out ears for you so that you can hear his voice through his word. Join me again next time as we take another look at the second part of this psalm. And until then, the Lord bless you.